So yeah, really understanding where people have come from determines how health-seeking they are. Sometimes you have to be quite probing and asking a lot of questions, which can also sometimes be seen as suspicious. This next portion is around female circumcision. I've got pictures, so I hope that's okay with everyone. Pictures of genitals, I'm sure you've all seen it. Yes, and because it's quite a heavy sort of topic and something that you might not be familiar with, do look after yourself. Yeah. Oh, and in the process, if I say the words female circumcision, female genital mutilation, and female genital cutting, for the purpose of this presentation, they all mean the same thing. So the WHO defines female genital mutilation as any partial or total removal of the external genitals for non-cultural or medical reasons. There are 4 classifications of female circumcision, and in 2016 WHO came out with these subsections of the first 3. So the first one is clitorectomy, or the partial or total removal of the clitoris, including the prepuce. So that's all the orange bit. And when you ask, so in 2008, one of the survey questions was, what is sunna or type 1 circumcision? And it went from a prick all the way to the total removal of the clitoris. So there is such a grey area. So type 2 is excision, which is the partial or total removal of the clitoris and labia minora, and potentially some suturing. So often it will be just 2 sutures. So type 3, and type 1 and 2 are the most common types in the world. About 95% of the world's population get type 1 or 2. But in New Zealand, we see type 3 a lot more, just because of the geographical area that we've got our refugee population from. Type 3 is infibulation, which is the total removal of the clitoris, the labia minora and majora, and then the complete suturing, which leaves a small opening that we call an introitus. And that's what it looks like. So it's a complete removal. So the introitus, the opening, that's 0.6 millimeters. And that's for urination, menstruation. And type 4, which was really interesting when WHO came out with these definitions last year, that the picture has a clitoral piercing. So type 4 is any pricking, piercing, or inserting of corrosive substances into the vagina. Are we all feeling okay? So about 15 years ago, we were saying 100 million girls and women are affected by FGM. 8 years ago, we were saying 140 to 150 million girls are affected. And as of 2016, we're saying 200 million girls and women are affected by FGM. And this could be attributed to the population growth, especially in places, predominantly in the places where FGM is practiced, there's high fertility rates. Yeah. And the majority, well, more than half of the world's genital mutilation can be accounted for in Indonesia, Egypt, and Ethiopia. So it's believed that circumcision started in Egypt because there was a mummy in 25 BC that was found that had infibulation, like complete removal. And it's sort of believed that it's sort of spread because the Somali word for type 3 is pharaonic, which means it's come from the pharaohs. And different countries practice differently. Even within the country, it can practice differently. In places like in Sudan and stuff, where women are circumcised, then recircumcised every time that they have a child or every time that their husbands are leaving for long, lengthy periods of time, they get recircumcised. Whereas in Somalia, if you're circumcised once, and then after that, once you get open or have a child, then you don't need to get recircumcised. For about 30 years, the UN has concentrated efforts of eliminating FGM in Africa because it was seen as an African issue. But the more we've asked the question of circumcision, the more countries that practice it. So any place where there is gender inequality, there seems to be practices like circumcision that occur. So circumcision happens in the Arab Peninsula, it happens in parts of Colombia, it happens at the end of last year. There was a report released by this American organisation that's working with Syrian refugees, and they were noting FGM as an issue that was coming up for them. So it'd be quite interesting to see with some of our other populations what's going on there. Yeah, so in New Zealand, we've never done a prevalence study, so it's really hard to know who has FGM and who doesn't. So this is something that the FGM education program gets asked a lot, is what are the numbers looking like in New Zealand? So this is a snapshot of the number of women who come from practicing countries in New Zealand. We don't have Kurdistan in this because in statistics, in the census data, the community either didn't identify themselves as Kurdish or there was just not a significant population. But that's one of the 5 groups that the FGM education program is working with. So how FGM is done, about 85% of all circumcision that occurs in the world occurs in rural settings. And this picture is from one of those tool buyback programs where they teach a woman another skill to make a living from, and in turn she has to hand back her tools, which is often really interesting in those communities where they've got different borders. There was this one woman at one of the African conferences where she had learned how to make baskets, but she still kept a circumcision tool in her bra because if she was low on money, she could just cross the border and still continue to circumcise girls. So because it happens in rural settings, there's no anaesthetic, there's no sanitation, there's no cleanliness of equipment either. So these are just crude objects that are used to circumcise girls. On the flip side, places like Malaysia, where there's about 90 to 100% of the girls are Indonesia, where 90 to 100% of the girls are circumcised, they do it in a medicalised setting, which we're seeing more of, this idea of medicalising circumcision. And what happens when medicalisation of circumcision, there's more tissue that's removed, where if you were doing it in a rural setting, not as much tissue would be removed. So to really understand circumcision and why it happens, you've got to understand the cultural context that continue the practice. So in a lot of, the first thing we've got to understand is circumcision is done by loving parents to ensure a brighter future for their children. It's a hard concept to kind of grasp when you've seen the images of how genitals turn out. But in the environment that these communities live in, it's done in the best interest of the child. It's a complex and deep-rooted cultural practice. Circumcision has been around for over 2,000 years. So to say, oh, you shouldn't do it, is not going to take away the cultural aspects of it. So circumcision and virginity are closely linked. It's a way of preserving a girl's family honour, because if she's tightly closed over, she protects the family honour. She will get married. In turn, she will get land. She will get lots of cattle when she gets married, because the dowry is the man's family giving money to the female's family. It's around purity and preserving a woman's sexual identity. In the process of this, it's celebrated. It's a cultural norm. If 98% of the population that you live within is doing it, it's a very normalised thing. It's seen as a woman entering womanhood. It's a rite of passage, like a sweet 16 for many Western cultures. So there's lots of traditional myths around why circumcision needs to happen. When I first became an educator, there was an older woman, and she said, before I received any form of education on this topic, I thought if we didn't cut the clitoris, it would just grow and start dangling like a male genitals, right? And I was like, that's such a bizarre thing, wouldn't you notice? But because it's passed down from generation to generation, and it's a culture that doesn't question your elders, there's not that real dialogue about it. It's just something that happens and you're meant to be proud of it, right? And then another myth I heard from one of my Ethiopian colleagues was in Ethiopia, the clitoris is removed because the mothers believe, if the clitoris is left on the child, that when she goes to give birth to a baby, that if the clitoris touches the baby's head, that the baby's going to die. So these are things that will scare you to death and will make you want to keep that. But it's also, I've met a lot of young girls who haven't been circumcised, but have this idea of, I want to be circumcised, because it's an identity issue. It's my mother was, my grandmother was, every other woman in my family has been circumcised, and to sort of fit in to that cultural society, it needs to be done. One of the most, I think, quoted reasons why FGM is still happening is this idea of it's a religious duty to be circumcised. Interestingly, nothing about female circumcision occurs in any of the religious texts. So in the Quran, it doesn't say anything about female circumcision, but there's this one hadith, which are a compilation of the actions and words of the Prophet, that he was one day walking and had walked past this woman that was circumcising her daughter, and the girl was screaming, and he said, don't hurt her. If you're going to do it, do a pinch. That's where the term sunnah comes from, the idea that you just need to pinch and make a little bit of blood. But that most religious scholars would say was a weak narration, because there wasn't like a really great chain of events that led to it. And there's no other religious text that talks about female circumcision, whereas male circumcision is clearly talked about in the Quran, in the Torah, and in the Old and the New Testament. So it's something that crosses all religions, and that's one of the most noted reasons. Like in the Ethiopian community, a girl will get circumcised at the age of 1 so she could go to church, and once she's pure, she'll be able to enter the house of God. Whereas in the Somali culture, it's between 4 and 11, and different other communities practice at different ages. I know in West Africa it's more group circumcision, and at the age of puberty, where a woman is entering womanhood. There is an immense social pressure around circumcision. Although it's genitals and no one really talks about it, there's a community pressure for daughters to be circumcised. I remember a few years ago my uncle was going to Hajj, and he's a medical doctor, and he was just like, no, I don't want my daughter circumcised, there's all these harms that come with it. But when he went off to Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage, his daughters had saved up enough money to get themselves circumcised. And when he came back, he was horrified, and he was like, why would you do it? And they had stopped going to school about 3 or 4 months before he even left, because the neighbourhood found out that they weren't circumcised. So there was great stigma attached to it. So no one would play with you, you're considered dirty, you can't go to school, you can't serve food, actually they just found it hard to go even out in public, because there's only one circumciser in the town that they lived in, and she knew who she had done and who she hadn't done. And it's because it's a really celebrated event, where you slaughter a sheep and you feed like the whole neighbourhood and everything. So it's a very celebrated thing, and they felt because they couldn't participate in that process of being celebrated, that they had to do it whether he liked it or not. So there's immense pressure around the community. The other thing is the role of the circumciser is important in this, where in West African countries, the circumciser is the only woman who's got the same level of power as other men in the community, and it's a livelihood, it's how they make their money, right, and earn a living. In Somalia, to circumcise one child, it's $100 US. $100 US can feed a family of 12 for a good month. So it's for circumcision to be eliminated, there needs to be other forms of income created. So this quote was from a midwife who knew the impact of circumcision from a health perspective, but really encompasses the social pressure and the need for women to get circumcised.